Well, good afternoon to everyone who's joining us this afternoon for today's Talking to Tours with Limelight Arts Travel. Before we begin and I introduce our guest for today, let me just read in the acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So thank you, everybody. And once again, welcome to Talking Tours. With me today, I have Dr. Nick Gordon, Director of Limelight Arts Travel, and tour leader for our contemporary art tours. He's been leading contemporary art tours now for over 10 years.
It is. It has been.
It has been. We were just talking about the first Venice Biennale tour you did for Limelight when we were just getting started as a company, and what fun that was.
It was awesome. Amazing, amazing experience, especially as the first one to get off the ground.
Yeah. So just so people who don't know you or haven't traveled with you before, or know your work here at Limelight, give us a bit of background about yourself.
Um, well, I had been a history lecturer for a number of years, as well as kind of an artist, mostly painting at the time. And I got kind of a phone call out of the blue asking me what if I would like to take a group of people to Italy to go and talk about the art and history of places like Rome, Florence, and Venice for 2 weeks and get paid to do it. Which is a great way to do research off the side of it. When that was now a bit over 20 years ago. Um, and I suppose about 5 years after that, I thought it would be actually a much more enjoyable way of helping people understand kind of the art and history of the world around them by kind of taking small groups of people to different countries to talk about those things in situ when we're surrounded by it, rather than doing it through kind of images on a screen or a bad projector in a classroom. There was also a lot less paperwork involved in taking groups than there is in working in universities, and that was very appealing too.
So the interactions with the people themselves on the ground.
Much more
Yeah.
stimulating,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, kind of adults who have traveled, have life experience, have their own background knowledge already, have much more interesting things to say about what they're seeing than 18-year-olds who probably haven't been anywhere before. Unsurprisingly. So I find it's personally much more rewarding as well to be talking to the sorts of people who are on our groups about the things that we're seeing.
Yeah, it just adds so much more to have people around you who are like-minded and interested and have that interest. Yeah.
Exactly.
So today we're actually here to talk about South Korea. Um, what is it about South Korea? We all know Japan is a contemporary art scene and its vibrant scene in Tokyo and now through the art islands in Naoshima and around Setouchi. But perhaps people don't know so much about South Korea and what's been happening there as an upcoming destination, particularly in this area.
A lot has been. And I suppose partly kind of what got me there was some of the very, I suppose, conceptually challenging work of a lot of contemporary Korean artists, and I was seeing their work in various biennales or exhibitions around the place. And from that, then I ended up kind of wanting to spend more time understanding what was behind that, and then not just from a distance, but actually being there on the ground and kind of seeing what was actually going on in this, I suppose, an art scene that's rapidly emerged very quickly. So it's been there, and it's been quite strong and influential since the 60s. But over the past 25 years, it's really started to explode. And we see that kind of not only in the visual arts, but say in the Korean film industry as well, and
Yes,
sort
of
of then
course.
K-pop going off at the same time. There's suddenly kind of there's something, some sort of critical mass had been reached on the ground where in all sorts, from the most kind of, from Gangnam Style through to very conceptual art by people like Lee Bull, it's really gone off. And I wanted to kind
Mm.
of see what was going on, what was behind that.
Certainly having a moment in the sun, isn't it? The Korean culture,
Yes.
etc. So you mentioned some of the artists already, but why do you think it has such a big art scene, particularly contemporary art scene, and what artists have brought that to the fore?
I think it's an interesting situation after or I suppose during the Korean War, where there had been, just prior to that, during Japanese occupation, there had been, I suppose, increased exposure to not only a Japanese intellectual world, but at that time, Japanese universities were much more internationally focused. Japan was considering itself an equal imperial member with the UK, with Germany, with the US as an imperial power, with Russia, and its universities had that intellectual focus. So a lot of the artists in Korea who were, say, training in the 30s and 40s were going to Japan and getting that international exposure. And then they've got all that kind of the Korean War conflict and kind of that, I suppose, very difficult situation to work in as an artist because you often would become, I suppose, hmm,
Pigeonholed or
more disliked by both sides. So,
okay.
for example, an
A
artist,
resentment.
exactly like Yoon Hyung Kun, who's a beautiful, beautiful painter. He develops this type of monochromatic style of painting in the 50s and 60s. But he's hated by both sides. So kind of the capitalists think he's a communist, and the communist thinks he's a capitalist pig dog. He loses his job at university,
Right.
hardly can get any work anywhere. Is arrested a few times, is tortured a couple of times, and then just goes back to his painting. Just produces these very unique works that are part of a very unique kind of monochromatic style that would influence people like Liu Yufan, who had to uh, well, like a number of artists in that period needed to leave Korea, or South Korea after the war had ended. So for some like Nam June Paik, who's kind of the founder of video art and was a huge international success, he has to not work in Korea because his father was a collaborator with the Japanese, so his family was not welcome in Korea until the late 80s when stops being a military dictatorship. And you get people like Nam June Paik who have got this international reputation, really cosmopolitan people coming back into the country as suddenly celebrated figures and doing work for things like was about the Seoul Olympics.
Okay.
And be as kind of, I suppose, held up as these great cultural figures, whereas others like Liu Fan just remains in Japan and is much more closely associated with Japan, although there are those influences of Korean work in the 60s that come through a little bit. So I suppose it's this political context, I suppose, around it
Mm.
that then I suppose once Korea opens up and moves away from being a political dictatorship, there's suddenly a lot more freedom of expression permitted. Cultural values start to become a little bit more liberal.
Mhm.
And there's then that economic boom through the 90s and early 2000s. So you start seeing this huge interest in the arts, this celebration of Korean art and Korean support for Korean artists as part of that, I suppose. It's not quite a nationalist movement, but it's more of, I suppose, this national pride that kind of really comes to the fore as it becomes more democratic.
Oh, so that's what informs the art as well, the burgeoning democracy, the idea of some more economic freedoms,
I think
do you
so.
think?
Yeah, and with that, there's this optimism, and I suppose whereas a lot of the art in the 50s and 60s is very, very restrained, very philosophical, kind of developing from Korean Buddhist thought in some ways. Whereas a lot of the later artists are kind of even if they're using traditional materials like mulberry paper, there's a lot more playfulness with it. There's this great sense of, well, let's really explore the possibilities. And out of that, you get wonderful kind of bizarrely dystopian works where people like Lee Bull, who kind of fits right in with, have you seen any dystopian Korean cinema? It's dark, but it's a very socially and very philosophically grounded dystopianism. But at the same time, there's this lightness about it, and there's kind of playfulness with the materials that I think kind of, yeah, the kind of, I think it's capturing the possibility of being in a much freer, more wealthy country, as well as kind of the realization, well, there's always a downside somewhere.
So we're constantly interpreting this, and you as a the tour leader constantly looking at these things and seeing how they fit
Exactly.
into the environment and everything else around it and what it is. Because um, I know we're going to talk about Liu Fan, but some people find his work uh, just incomprehensible. It's just, it's very, as you said, monochromatic. It's of a certain type of school. I remember the name of what
Yeah.
that is, and it just doesn't have much to it. And people go, I don't understand what that is.
Yeah.
But you can bring that to life.
Yes, Leo Fun is a wonderful person to try and explain because it is just really hard to explain. I recently had the joy of trying to just kind of help people get their heads around Leo Fun in 5 minutes, but I was doing it in front of um, a contemporary art historian who is very, very top of his game, very well respected. And I'm sitting there going, oh, geez, hey, does this sound okay for him? He knows I'm doing it in 5 minutes too. Um, we're just talking to him afterwards, and he says, yeah, sometimes I try and explain Liu Fan as you have to imagine that the rock and the sheet of steel are actually having a conversation with one another. And as soon as you say that, you sound mad. But you're encouraging people to look at the empathetic reaction between the stone towards the steel, almost as if the steel is its offspring or the steel is one of the potential things to come from the potential held within the stone. Um, but there is a philosophy behind that, and I suppose part of Liu Fan's context is that he's a leader in this movement to have Asian art recognized as not an offshoot of European art, not a branch of something that's influenced by European art, but something that has its own philosophy that pre-exists Europe, its own practices, its own way of understanding the world, and that European interaction is just one of many forms of interaction that Asian cultures have had with each other, with foreign cultures. So it's kind of this movement of seeing kind of Asian art as its own independent entity, and that's been, I think, inspiring for. It still is inspiring for artists across the region today.
And Korea in itself, this sense of new economics in the 80s, etc., coming forward through private companies like Samsung and Kumho and the tire companies. Um, there's been a lot of philanthropy through that, whereas I guess back in the West, we're a little bit more used to institutions and government funded things. So I guess that sets up freedoms for art galleries and artists. Do you think that's philanthropy has had a big influence on the
Absolutely,
artistic
yes,
scene?
absolutely. So there are excellent government institutions now, but say things like the National Museum of Modern Contemporary Art only started collecting quite recently, so it doesn't
Okay.
have 100 years of collecting behind it. Whereas private collectors had been able to start amassing these collections and supporting artists directly by buying their work well before there were kind of strong state institutions to provide a venue for it. So Samsung or the Lee family, who kind of own Samsung amongst other things, um, have been incredible contributors to developing not just their own collection. So it's not a vanity project. They put a lot of their money into kind of what the Leo Museum in Seoul, for example, is a magnificent, very contemporary museum. It has works that are looking back on, say, on retrospectives of key artists, and at the same time, you'll have cutting edge work from artists, sort of international artists coming over. So they're kind of seeing part of their role as providing a venue for interaction for artists in Seoul now to be able to see some of the best, most challenging contemporary work from around the world. But also thinking that that encourages sort of kids turning up, young artists going to somewhere like that today are getting this exposure from a very young age. And speaking of somebody who grew up in the Blue Mountains, exposure to contemporary art is something that came
And you
not when
later.
I was 5 years old.
Certainly not. And of course, with that, the sort of the architecture that they build to present these works, it sort of goes hand in hand in a way, doesn't it? The adventure of what they build.
Absolutely, yes. And they kind of their And again, it's having kind of the great building or having a building that can be quite playful in the way that it
Mm,
houses the art is part of it's not so much personal promotion, it's not so much about something as vain as that, but it is, I think, partly about reputation. And that if you've reached a certain status in society, you say kind of, well, you're kind of one of the I know one of the great international multinational companies now that are kind of are based in Korea. That there's almost a sense, well, kind of that brings with it the obligation to be putting something back into society in some way. And in that respect, I think it's a way of thinking perhaps about the role that's similar to the way you have great um, industrial families in Japan
mm.
doing something similar. Thinking of the Ishibashi Foundation, kind of who are Bridgestone, and they're an amazing collection. They do something that's very, very similar. And I think there's a way of thinking about your need to visibly contribute back to society as a reflection of your status. So it's not as strong as an obligation. I'm not quite sure what the right word for it is.
Do you think like an amazing space to exhibit in for a contemporary artist actually helps and informs their work, contextualizes what they might actually put into that building?
Sometimes, yes,
I
yeah.
suppose that's a very individual thing, but
It is, and kind of the way the artist has to then work with a curator or a curatorial
mm,
team. Um, so there was a fantastic Pierre Huy exhibition in Seoul a couple of years ago, where there were things like these floating fish. There were self-propelled floating fish, other things that were moving around, playing music, responding to the environment. And they were partly responding to kind of the tracking of human movements in the space. So you would have things like fish, these floating fish following you around through an art gallery. But part of what
wow.
was also what was um, where they were getting their data from was also this like a giant weather station. So kind of the Lille Museum has this long platform and up above that's very visible where you can display quite monumental works of art. And the artist had built this like a giant weather station sticking up out of it that looked just had all its cables coming out all over the place as well, but it was providing environmental data. So kind of and that was it was the machines inside were using that data, interpreting that data, changes in air pressure, changes in kind of humidity,
Wow.
and that was feeding into some of the movements and the way the lights were moving inside. So that was a very unique way of using the space of trying to separate the barrier between inside and outside of the museum by using data from outside to affect what happened inside. But I think it's very personal. It depends on the
That's
artist.
an interesting concept when we look back, and let's look into the history a bit of South Korea or Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and then South Korea having been so associated with China in the early days, and then moving into its own country, and then the influence of Japan in America post-war. Um, how's that shaped the country today? The history of where it's come from and the influences that have come through there.
I think today, just the short answer is that Koreans are very aware of that history and have an immense pride in it. So if we think back to say I suppose one of those great early periods under the Silla
Mm.
Dynasty, who managed to unite the Korean peninsula. Today, what we think of the peninsula today, which had previously is more defined as kind of a linguistic community. But they had managed to unify that peninsula in around the 6th century CE. Um, and it led to, I suppose, this kind of great sense of the country can be unified, and the unification of the people of the country can lead to a sort of, I suppose, a cultural golden age. So the Silla tombs, which we can talk about, they've got
Mm.
these extraordinary artifacts that survived unexcavated until the 20th century. And we've got all of this just amazing information about what they were producing. The quality of their metallurgy is exceptional. And then I think there are kind of things like metallurgy, skill with ceramics, particularly celadon ware when that comes in, and that
Which is
becomes.
Very well known in Korea.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
Celadon.
Um, so you get collections just of early Celadon ware from the 10th century, and each piece is perfect. Some of it, you look at kind of those rooms of these tiny Celadon bowls, none of which have a crack in them. They're so well preserved. It's quite amazing, and people treat them with reverence as kind of
Mm,
this is part of it. This is a national art form. It's something that requires a huge amount of skill to create, like well, a lot of the goldsmithing. It's a highly skilled activity. And I think that this kind of builds into, I suppose, a kind of if we can talk of something as broad as a national culture that privileges work of craftsmanship, skill, work that requires dedication to master the knowledge of how to do something. So less about looking for a quick fix or kind of how do we do this faster and cheaper. It's got much stronger culture of well, kind of learning to master it and do it properly is better than doing it cheaper. And that you find kind of looking at the modern the modern period where you think of things like the number of what is it, semiconductors and other such things, shipping,
yeah.
shipbuilding, specialist machinery, high-tech industries that are all flourishing there. But it's this sense of kind of be able to kind of, I suppose, this pride that people extend back into the objects they see from their past and can see, I think, a continuity of this as a country with a tradition of patient craftsmanship to master something and then extend what you can do with it. I suppose the other part of that, though, in the 20th century is the post-war division of Korea between North and South.
Of course.
So when your national history is talking about the importance of unification, the post-war disunification, the division of the country, is still something that is deeply felt in South Korea, where it's felt as kind of sympathy and empathy towards the troubles faced by your family on the other side of the border, even if you've never met them. But now it's multiple generations who have never met and interacted. There's still a sense of loss and grief, and kind of concern over the plight of people in North Korea and the South and not so much worry about kind of whatever Kim Jong, which Kim Jong Un is parading through the streets. And not kind
Yeah.
of so it's amazing how little worry there is about it. It's kind of no, he's not actually going to do it. He's just doing his thing.
Yeah. Just pumping up his chest and beating his
Exactly.
chest.
Yeah.
So we a lot of these things you talk about we'll see as you tour around South Korea, but I guess beginning in Seoul itself, we talked to the contemporary art scene, but there's but also the great national pride and the National Museum itself, which is just extraordinary in Seoul, and their collections of what they have. You mentioned Celadon, but the Buddhist statues.
Yes. Yes. And I think I could have so as you say, kind of it's an extraordinary collection, and those Buddha statues that are some of them, a couple of them get just rooms to themselves, where kind of there's almost like a pilgrimage. You go through the corridor of darkness to then be this room where you can then walk around these beautifully carved Buddhas. And part of the pride in Buddhas in those ones is not just the beauty of the sculpture; they're so well preserved and they are so beautifully crafted, but part of the story of those in Korea as well, kind of these are also symbols of Korea's cultural influence abroad because they're Buddha statues that would, from the period they were made, were kind of style of Buddha that was then being uh, exported into Japan.
Right.
And you get this kind of role that Korea has in kind of um, things, styles from Korea, skills from Korea in early Japanese history. Kind of it's a conduit. Things get into Japan from mainland Asia through Korea. They have a Korean inflection.
That the
And
Japanese don't like to recognize.
no, they don't like that very much at all. But even though they know it was the 15th century when the Japanese went over and kind of kidnapped whole villages of ceramicists to bring them back to
Mm,
Kyushu to kind of to bring the skills to make that sort of fine work there. There's still also a sense of that's a very difficult relationship between the two countries at times.
yeah, that's a different conversation
I
for
think
another
so. I
day, I
think
think.
so. It's a complicated one. Yeah.
But the lifestyle of Koreans, so that's seen in the traditional villages that still remain in certain areas, particularly in Seoul, where we travel through a traditional Hanok village. the type of housing and sort of in those areas, how traditionally how people lived in that is
Yeah. It's interesting because it's you still get those pockets. So in say take a city like Seoul, which is a very, very modern city in most respects, but it still has these pockets of where traditional housing, whether if they're on the side of a hill, kind of it's
mm,
very difficult. The lanes aren't designed for cars, so they tend to be much more pedestrianized. You then tend to have walls that then form kind of a wall that's part the wall of the house, but then also partly a wall that separates the internal courtyard. Um, so you can get these, yeah, wood and stone buildings. You get the traditional ceramic tiles, garden wherever you can. I suppose that's another thing that's interesting. Korean gardens, even their small courtyard gardens, have a kind of very deliberate, natural feel about them. And it's interesting when you read uh, the statements in English about the helpful ones that are put there by the museums to try and help you understand kind of more about, well, why is this traditional architecture, this traditional garden, slightly messy looking? And they're quite clear in their intention that they will say that the Korean aesthetic is not as highly stylized as China's aesthetic,
mm,
and it's not as abstract as Japan's aesthetic, and it has this kind of wild naturalness about it. So things like kind of people will leave certain types of what look like weeds growing there, or kind of trees will be
okay.
pruned in a way to try and maintain this air of naturalness. And you see some of that in these traditional villages that kind of areas that in other countries would be pristine because that's their aesthetic. In Korea, they're often left to be slightly rough around the edges,
More
but it's a
naturalistic.
naturalistic, but
Yeah.
still it's still all human crafted. So artificial environment, but yeah, exactly. They're trying to be more naturalistic, which coming from if you're coming from Japan can make it look a little bit messy in places, but it's
Mm.
a just a deliberate aesthetic approach.
Yeah, and there's still people living there today. So
There
you're
are.
walking through the streets and there are signs everywhere saying, "Don't speak too loudly." Don't.
Yes. Yes, and right of the walls are also quite thin.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, and that kind of now as well, kind of because people live there, then sort of we don't want large guided groups coming through. And so people, we understand that people want to kind of see a more traditional way of living, but on the other hand, yeah, like yeah, people don't like being woken up on Sunday morning by uh, 40 loud tourists going, "Oh, good, let's look through this window."
It's sort of one of those pitfalls of modern tourism today that we see in many cities like Kyoto and Venice as well. But
It is.
yeah, just trying to have that relationship between
Yeah,
tourism and actual people who still live there and that
exactly.
respect between it. But
Yes.
I think that it's done very well when people do go through there.
It is, and particularly as we do in the earlier in the morning.
Yeah.
And it's a very pleasant places where you can stroll down into the city to areas where you've got then the the former royal palaces, which are now all museums. Yeah.
Which was my next point. I mean, how many palaces are there in Seoul?
There are three royal palaces. They're all reasonably close together.
Yeah, walking distance, really.
Yes, yeah,
There's two of them that I know of.
yes,
Yes.
yeah. Um, Yes, so they each were favored by different monarchs in different
Okay.
periods, but they still each remained royal residences. Um, so the one that was favored by the last of the kings of Korea is much larger, much grander. You walk through those brilliant kind of red and decorated gates with all kind of the flower
Mhm.
decorations around it. This huge gate, and you walk into a kind of what's effectively a military parade ground. And if you go into there today at certain times, like in the opening hour in the morning, there'll be kind of all the gentlemen dressed up in their kind of traditional military robe, and they'll be drumming and doing things and kind of making use of the parade ground. But then you move from that very formal space into decreasingly formal spaces until you kind of get, well, this is the last emperor's bedroom.
Yeah.
And it's nothing grand. It's not much larger than this office. There's enough room for a bed, his writing table, somewhere to put his books, and somewhere for to keep a glass of water overnight. So it's interesting you get this grandeur that as you move through the palace complex becomes more and more domestic in scale. But because different emperors or parts of their family preferred to live in different places, you get kind of say one of the earlier palaces, the one with the secret garden.
Yes.
In a moment. Okay, has the sound come back on? Okay, okay. Oops, oops, oops. Um, I think I've got back a little bit. Hopefully this works okay. Yes, but something happened with our perfect. Okay, thank you for letting us know the sound is back.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
Um,
So we were talking about garden, the secret garden at that particular palace. I'm going to attempt to say it. John.
yes, yes. So saying that there's this as the palaces become more and more I suppose in domestic, more private spaces, they have all of these garden space built into them out the back. That's out the back, I suppose. So you have all of this, the public space out the front, the part that's about for ceremony and for display. And then from that, you just move out the back into these more garden spaces. And these are, I'll say, right in the middle of Seoul today. But you can be in these gardens and you can't see the high rise, you can't hear the traffic. You get these beautiful, tranquil spaces just to be able to walk around. And it's amazing that they're still there. It's amazing that you can still be in what is the most densely populated modern city and still find greenery right in the middle, which is a kind of
It's extraordinary.
it is.
One other point that I remember from being there was that I didn't mention to talk about with you, but it's just popped into my head about the heated underflooring and the reticulation systems for the water
Yeah. Yes.
that they had. Um,
Yes. Of course. Because yeah, it's yeah, great thing to bring up because Seoul is freezing in winter.
mm,
And it remains for centuries remains it's the capital city. So it's the center of the court, it's the center of the administration. And you've got these buildings that when you visit them in the warmer months, you can see how the airflow works. in kind of all these sliding doors and passages and breezeways. You can see how all that's there for when, say, if you're there in August and it's 40 degrees, it's fantastic 'cause it's natural cooling. But then having those waterways moving through helps provide cooling in the warmer months, but that it's heated during the winter. So you're walking through and you see the kind of, yeah, there's all of these underfloor heated rooms because otherwise it would just be too cold. So kind of try and
And it wasn't like the Romans with their actual bathhouses. It was literally a heating system for
yeah.
the palace or for the rooms in the palace.
Yes, yeah, all this kind of all built in under the ground.
So practical.
Yes, and with all the kind of the work needed to supply the heat done on the outside, so kind of the people feeding the fires that were heating the water, keeping the house inhabitable, but doing that in, I hope, fur boots outside in the snow.
Yeah, yeah. It's the other place where I learned about, because I never realized why the Korean language, the written language, looks so different. And I always assumed that it came from somewhere else. It came from it was adapted from China or something else. But at that particular class, that's where I learned that it was more of a democratization for the people.
Absolutely, yes. So Mandarin remained the kind of the
Scholarly.
this exactly the scholarly language, the language of the court. Um, but Korean up until the 15th century had to be transliterated into Chinese characters. So you'd have to try and find an equivalent sound or an equivalent concept to then use. But in the middle of the 15th century, one of the rulers of Korea invents a language. And part of why it looks so different is that each of the symbols is the shape of your mouth and your tongue when you make that sound. So it's kind of they're perfect phonemes. Each symbol is a phoneme. There are more phonemes in Korean than there are in English, which makes kind of some of the subtleties of Korean pronunciation. I remember kind of had worked quite hard to get my pronunciation on names and place names right, and a Korean friend of mine was kind of looking at me, smiling, going, "Yeah, that's very good," and nice and kind of condescendingly. It's like, kind of, that's as close as you're going to get to an English speaker. No, she was very good about it. It's like, no, it's more of this sound than that sound. Try doing this with your mouth rather than that with your mouth. But yes, you have these two languages and writing systems side by side. So now, as you walk around the palaces, for example, or around historic buildings, you'll notice that kind of there's all of this Chinese script everywhere. And in some cases, that's actually Chinese. In other cases, that's Korean transliterated into Chinese as an official language. But that official language was only spoken by a small number of people, a scholarly and ruling class, who still needed to be able to communicate with in the language of everyday people. It's got this bizarre kind of three different alphabets in the same historic space, or three different writing systems in the same historic space.
It's just fascinating the way that someone's processed that and come up with that to sort of, I guess, to the illiterate peasant class to then be able to teach them through. If your mouth makes this sound, that's what this means.
Exactly.
How to read.
Yes.
It's an interesting concept.
It is. And this was the other thing on that that's quite interesting because there's a lot of pride in the Korean alphabet and the history of the alphabet. But there's also similar pride in kind of printing, and having a very strong print culture. As the oldest known woodblock print is Korean. It's from the 8th century AD, the oldest known surviving woodblock print. But movable metal type was being used in Korea from the 1220s onwards. So a good 200 years before Gutenberg's come up with it, kind of Koreans have movable type printing presses, which they're printing Confucian and Buddhist texts with them.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's great pride in kind of, little did you know that kind of we've been using movable metal type 200 years before Gutenberg.
Certainly a lot of depth in the culture and history of Korea, South Korea or Korea, that we don't realize, we don't know that you learn from doing things like going there and being with someone with the knowledge and the guides to show you around. We sort of touched on Seoul being so vast and huge, population density, etc. But there's lots of green space, and there's one particular museum you visit, more in the countryside, the Sun Museum, and sort of some stories associated with that.
Yes, so Korea is mostly forested mountains. So the valleys become quite densely populated, and Seoul is another world. It's green spaces as they're redeveloping parts of the city. All the services go underground, and that way around the office blocks and residential blocks, it's kind of becoming more open, pedestrian, green, and that's very deliberate. But when you go, because it's so dense, it means it's reasonably easy to get out of the countryside, and people do.
Mm. And there's a great metro system, so I'll just throw it in
Yeah.
there.
Yes, the public
Yeah.
transport's great, and it's a fully integrated system. So kind of the same card works on all
Mm.
public transport, works on the taxi, works in the 7-Eleven as well. It's kind of wonderful. We'll get there one day. Um, um, but it's surrounding it. So kind of there is this beautiful museum about an hour and a half out of Seoul, up in the forested mountains, which is a Tadao Ando designed museum of art and nature. And it's this idea of creating a building that harmonizes with the landscape, which Tadao Ando does beautifully. Sort of his,
Signature, isn't it?
yes,
Mm.
yeah. And it's a beautiful structure which allows views in and out the way the glass walls are placed to frame these views across this countryside, which is the mountain is a kind of a celebrated cultural form. As kind of a symbol in Korea of kind of the mountain is kind of the mountain, but the sun and the sky is kind of that's almost symbolic of what the country is. Um, so that's a beautiful museum to visit. It has the most exceptional James Turrell installation I've ever seen, and it keeps going. There's more of it, and just the way he changes your perception in all of these different ways. There are absolutely no photographs allowed inside, which I also kind of think you have to go to see it,
Oh, wow. Okay.
which is good. But surrounding all of that, there are all of these golf courses, and that's kind of another great kind of uh, pastime, I suppose, of the middle class, the upper middle class, is to escape the city to go and play golf in the countryside, surrounded by mountains and forests. And what you'll probably see is a lot of mixed doubles being played, um, usually between a slightly older man and a slightly younger woman. And it's kind of, 'cause technically adultery is kind of illegal still in
Right.
Korea,
Okay.
but everybody does it. So it's like what you kind of come across in Korean soap operas, that there's all this going on that everybody knows, and it's only okay if nobody really sees it too obviously because everybody knows and kind of everyone's doing it in one way or another. Different ideas about what counts as fidelity and kind of the role
Oh.
of marriage and family compared to personal romance and that sort of stuff. But if you're middle or upper middle class, you go and do this on the golf course because you're far enough away from Seoul that only you and the other invitees can see who's doing what with whom as they're playing golf. They have these wonderful restaurants set up in all of the golf clubs. Had some of the best Italian I've ever had outside of Italy. In one of these golf clubs, it was kind of but it is funny. You're just walking around and kind of going, "Yep, every one of these golf pairs is an illicit love affair." And they're kind of like a soap drama. There's all that gossip going on behind.
Intrigue.
Yes, yes,
So we leave Seoul and we're going to head on their high-speed train.
yes,
We're going to go down to Busan,
yes.
down on the coast.
Yes, so Busan is very much Korea's second city and its main port. But it's strange because it's a very long, thin city that extends between the mountains and the coastline. Um, so you have these very different neighborhoods in it.
Like the Gemchong Cultural Village.
Exactly, yes, yeah, which is the Gamcheon Cultural Village is. um, created because during the Korean War, as more and more people were needing somewhere to live in the south, and there was less and less room in the south that was safe for quite a time, you had all of this kind of housing built very, very quickly on this kind of these steepish hills going down towards the sea. Um, but they were well built, so they weren't kind of they weren't designed to be shanty towns. They're
Yeah.
actual small houses, but they're all stacked together with these little laneways in between them. But as they slowly became less desirable to live in, it's much, much easier to just move to an apartment block than it is to try and retrofit everything you need into these tiny streets and tiny kind of houses all clustered around each other. It got those space to preserve that space. They started moving small designers in, started encouraging kind of boutique shops to move in, small art galleries, and other makers into it. So you kind of get this little district inside the city of all of these brightly coloured houses looking out over the seaside, with all of these kind of boutiques and things in them. And
Mm.
it's a lovely place to stroll around, and they do have museums that we can go and see. Kind of, well, this is the history of the place. This is what it used to look like. And you can see you can see why the kind of you'd rather now, you would rather live in a modern apartment block with all the convenience and not have kind of not having to live in a building that's had water, electricity, sewerage, heating, and now internet retrofitted into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Much easier to move to a modern building, but they've preserved the history as a.
Yeah, you look out on the hillside and you see this brightly colored, massive buildings. It's really quite lovely.
It is, and it's quite vibrant, and people kind of do travel there to walk around and to kind of stroll, and kind of you can get a good coffee there as well, which always helps.
And then on the other side of that, going down to the sea, you've got this amazing temple with
Yes,
all the stairs that go down. And
yes. So it's at the other end, saying that it's a very long, narrow city. The what's that direction? That would be the northeastern end of the city. It's a Buddhist temple. It's a water temple. Um, so most temples are up in the mountains. This one is rare because it's built on the coastline, built into the coastline. It's a beautiful Buddhist temple complex. You are greeted at the front by a small pagoda to road safety, which is paid for and maintained by Kumho, the tire company. But it's another interesting part of their patronage as well. As kind of, well, we build tires that keep people safe, so we'll be the patrons of a pagoda to road safety, which is it's quite interesting. You don't expect to see a tire company
yeah,
being a patron of a religious building. But then you walk down through these stairs to different parts of this temple complex built into the coastal cliff, I suppose. And it's very popular. It's a very popular place for Koreans to visit as well, not just kind of out of towners coming to
yeah,
see a beautifully located temple up by the sea.
okay. And yet we find more contemporary art in Busan. So one of the reasons we're visiting at the time of visiting is it's time to be at home.
It is. It is. Busan has been doing very well at promoting itself as a not only as a cultural destination, but as a great cultural producer as well. So things like the film industry. You get kind of the Busan Film Festival is one of the usually rated in the top five of all film festivals in the world, for its quality and its scope. And the Busan Biennale has been developing that way too, in through very intelligent curation, the range of artists that are being brought in, the sort of funding that it gets to be able to undertake quite substantial projects. So one of the things they've been doing more recently has been moving into former historic spaces that are no longer used, or former buildings or structures that have to do with the city's industrial past, and are kind of reclaiming and reusing those spaces as a way of kind
Mm.
of finding ways for artists to be able to reflect on and interact with not just the city's history, but kind of the region's history more broadly. Because Busan, as the main port of Korea, is also kind of very closely then connected to Fukuoka in Japan, which is today is 2 hours on the hydrofoil, not far. Along with all of the coastal cities of China as well. So kind of it's a great place for a Biennale if you're interested in working with artists who can bring out different aspects of the region's history and kind of and its culture. And they're very, very good at looking and finding the right sort of spaces to do that in.
Yeah, it's got such a different feel to it than Seoul. It's such a different sort of city. And then we go back in time. We go to Gwangju
It's
and we go visit, as we mentioned before, the Silla Kingdom and the royal tombs, which have been preserved basically until well, you tell us when they were first found and excavated in modern times.
and one of those things. So the royal tombs, as you've seen, are these kind of these huge hills. Well, not hills. They're small
Yeah.
hills, huge mounds. And it's very difficult to imagine losing them because there's a lot of them. There's a few hundred years worth of royal family members buried in the one area, each with their kind of their big tumulus. But they weren't just that the way they were constructed was to be almost impossible to excavate. So you have the initial structure, which is partly subterranean, built with kind of very large monumental pieces of masonry to create the tumulus, which is then covered over with smaller stones, covered over with smaller stones, covered over with gravel, covered over with dirt, and then has plants and grass growing over it, and if they've been left for too long, trees growing into it. So there's no way you can actually excavate into it because if you try and dig your shovel too far in, it just fills in on itself, and you can't get to the inner structure. That is until you have mechanized earth moving equipment. And it was during the Japanese occupation that kind of Japanese archaeologists wanted to know what was inside because there's a lot of them. They were aware that the Silla Kingdom is a period which is connected to Japanese history. There are kind of things in southern Japan which very closely resemble them, so they know there's something going on here. They're not so far away. We know they're connected or influencing each other in some way. So they wanted to know what was the size. They brought in the bulldozers. And the first couple that they did get inside, but it caused the entire building to collapse, the entire structure to collapse. But they started finding all of these perfectly preserved golden crowns, golden cloaks, earrings, bracelets, all the trappings for horses and other things, all of kind of them, the ceremonial swords. And the workmanship of it is amazing. And because they haven't been touched for 1500 years, you get the whole piece. So you don't get like bits of the crown, or sometimes you see kind of we have parts of the ornamentation of a belt. It's like, no, you've got the whole belt, and in some cases the leather is still there.
Yeah, they're intact and preserved, and luckily in the local museum. They've gone to the National Museum, so you can see them there. And just the detail in it, the little links, the things coming off the crowns or the earrings, etc. It's
Yeah,
extraordinary.
it is. It's the first time I saw them, I was astounded as well. I'm just like kind of I'm used to seeing kind of really good things, great things in archaeological museums, but their state of preservation and the number of them was just kind of and they, as you say, it's kind of you can see all of the workmanship in every piece. So they're really very beautiful, and it's rare to be able to see so much so well preserved. The modern excavations don't destroy the structure. It should be said. They found ways of being able to get inside without causing them to collapse, which is good. But there are still plenty there which are not unexcavated still. They would have to build another few museums, I think, to house what if they did open them up.
Yeah. Well, there's so many that just haven't been touched by the looks of it.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's just a fascinating place. Like you've taken us through um all different things from coming backwards from contemporary and then through the main city of Seoul and then through Little Super Sound and into the past. This tour sort of covers a lot, including um, the Biennale in Busan, and another one that in Guangdong that we're going to head to as well. But I think we're sort of running a little bit out of time over time. If anyone want to take the opportunity to put some questions in chat, if they had any, that's fine. But before we wrap it up, something that might be not uh, people might not know much about in Korea is the food, or might even be a little bit scared of the spices, the kimchi, all the different things, the way you eat the different things. Do you want to give us a little insight into?
Yes. Korean food has an enormous range of flavors. So what we see of it in Australia is a very, very small slice of it. So often it's not as spicy as you might think, because a lot of the way of creating the things like gochujang, the pepper paste, along with the kind of the pepper powder, is they de-seed the chilies before they roast them and then powder them. So you get all of that chili flavor without getting all of the heat. So a lot of the dishes can be quite mild. There are pickles galore. I think officially there are 117 different types of kimchi, but they're only official
Officially.
categories of kimchi because everyone's grandma has a different way of making the kimchi. From a friend's grandma, the perfect way of making something like kimchi, which has no fish or seafood product in it, so a family member could eat it too. And I was going to you use pear rather than
Yes,
it's a Buddhist tradition.
yeah, they do use pear a lot, don't they,
Yeah.
in their cuisine, and yeah, it's got the enzymes in it that help.
And it helps create a kind of that umami flavor without needing to add kind of a shrimp or a fish-based element to it. Yeah, which is kind of interesting. Um, but yes, so there are always lots of pickles. The heat range, some dishes can be hot, but most tend to be quite mild. There'll often be a slightly warming sensation, but not like it's not like a chili heat. So to tell you, it's a very subtle. It's often very delicate, and it's very vegetable based. Like it's a
Yeah, I think people think of Korean barbecue, but that's just one aspect of the cuisine, one very small aspect of the cuisine, the use of vegetables, the use of seafood is
yes,
quite widespread as well. I went to a restaurant in Seoul and they were advertising crab, and I thought, great, I love crab. It actually came out as the picture showed, raw.
oh wow, so it's the
Yeah, but it was still quite delicious.
yes,
It
yeah,
was still beautiful because it was so fresh and wonderful. I guess what I guess we're saying is something to try and not be scared of.
yes,
Mm.
yeah, yes. There are some things like kind of the octopus, local
Mm.
delicacy, where the octopus is so recently killed before being served on the plate as a tartare. Its tentacles are, so the octopus is killed, its tentacles are then cut up, but it has to get to the plate and to the table so quickly that the nerves are still going. Yeah, and that can be a little bit confronting, seeing this plate of cut up tentacle um, around. But other than that, there's not too much that's um, yeah, it's not always that confronting. Yes.
It was offered to me and I declined. And I'm pretty adventurous with my food.
Yes.
But that's something else to look forward to, just not just museums, art galleries and temples, it's the whole range and gamut of what Korea brings.
And it's a great love of showing off to foreigners,
Yeah.
or kind of just what their cuisine is like. I think it's another source of pride.
And then after dinner we can all go and have a sing song.
Finally, we should mention that kind of the earliest written reference to the people of the Korean Peninsula appears in a Chinese text written about 2,000 years ago that more or less says that the people of Korea, they like to drink and dance. But it is still on a very joyful. And during the warmer months, it's common that kind of whole streets shut down to become just kind of this is now just a big it's the beginning of spring. We are all outside. All kind of
Of
suddenly
course.
restaurants spill out onto the streets,
Yeah.
and people are just having a good time, enjoying life.
Happy to see the spring after the long winter.
Yes, I imagine so.
Well, I think on the note of joy, that's a good way to sort of wrap things up, Nick. You certainly sort of given us a lot to think about and talk through on today's talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope everyone has enjoyed it. The session will have been recorded. Apologies for the technical issues earlier. So you'll be sent the link to that if you'd like to review anything or go back and watch again at a later date. It's always welcome. Again, thank you all for joining us today on Talking to Us at Limelight Arts Travel, and we'll hopefully see you next time for a chat on New Zealand and the Festival of Wearable Art in Wellington.
Yes.
Yes.
Look forward to listening to that too.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.